If you thought MKUltra was the most twisted government experiment, think again. These are 10 forgotten experiments that were way worse than MKUltra. Secret labs, human test subjects, and mind-breaking methods. Let's dive in. Project Sunshine. Okay, buckle up because Project Sunshine sounds like something out of a sci-fi nightmare. In the 1950s, the US government wanted to study how radioactive fallout affected the human body. But they didn't just want any bodies, they specifically wanted infant and young human tissue samples. Why? Because young bones absorb radioactive isotopes differently. So what did they do about it? They went around the world secretly collecting parts of those that were deceased without informing families. The project was run by the US Atomic Energy Commission, and it involved cooperation from doctors and hospitals around the globe. In one now infamous case, a British woman discovered that her kid's body had been used without her permission. The scandal didn't even break until decades later, and even then, only scraps of truth were released. Sunshine, more like a storm cloud of ethical nightmares. The Monster Study. In 1939, at the height of the Great Depression, researchers at the University of Iowa decided to test how positive versus negative reinforcement affected speech. Noble idea, right? But their method, not so noble. They took orphans from a state-run institution and divided them into two groups. One group was praised for their speech, the other was ridiculed, criticized, and made to believe that they had speech problems, even if they didn't. Over time, some of these children developed lifelong speech issues, anxiety, and emotional trauma. Lead researcher Wendell Johnson ironically had a speech disorder himself. He stuttered and wanted to prove that environment caused speech problems, not biology. The whole thing was kept under wraps for decades and only came to light in the early 2000s. It's called the Monster Study for a reason. Unit 731. Most people haven't even heard of Unit 731, but it was one of the most horrifying experimental programs in history. Set up in Manchuria during World War II, this Japanese unit disguised itself as a water purification center. In reality, it was a biological warfare lab. Scientists, if you can call them that, conducted unthinkable tests on prisoners, including frostbite studies, chemical exposure, and disease injections. Victims were often kept alive during procedures to observe general effects. The man in charge, General Shiro Ishii, who later avoided prosecution in exchange for sharing his research with the US. That's right, the data was considered so valuable, the Allies cut a deal. No trials, no consequence, just silence. This entire horror show was buried under diplomacy and Cold War politics. Operation Sea Spray. In 1950, the US Navy launched Operation Sea Spray, a secret experiment to test how vulnerable American cities were to biological attacks. They chose San Francisco as their test site and sprayed a cloud of bacteria over the city from a naval ship off the coast. The bacteria, Serratia marcescens, was believed to be harmless at the time, but shortly after, several residents developed unusual infections, and at least one man died from the complications related to heart valve infections. The man sued the government but lost. But the real kicker, the government didn't tell anyone for decades. They just used the entire population as unsuspecting test subjects in a real-world simulation. No warnings, no follow-ups, just a quiet clinical note in military archives. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. From 1932 to 1972, the US Public Health Service ran a study on black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, promising free medical care, food, and burial insurance. The catch? They weren't actually treating the men, they were just observing the progression of syphilis over decades. Even after effective treatment became available, the researchers chose not to intervene, all to see what would happen. Participants weren't told that they were in a study, they were simply misled again and again. The experiment ran for 40 years before being exposed by a whistleblower in 1972. Public outrage followed, and President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology in 1997. The impact was devastating, both to those involved and to generations that followed, who came to deeply distrust medical institutions. Project Artichoke. Before MKUltra became a household name among conspiracy theorists, there was Project Artichoke, an earlier CIA venture in the 1950s that explored mind control, hypnosis, and forced confessions. This was the prototype. Operatives wanted to know, could someone be programmed to carry out tasks against their will? The experiments used a blend of hypnosis, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and other methods designed to break a person mentally. Foreign detainees, prisoners, and even CIA agents themselves were used as test subjects. The goal was to create the perfect Manchurian candidate, someone who could be controlled like a puppet. Details about Artichoke remained buried under classified documents until portions were released decades later. And even now, most of it is still shrouded in secrecy. The Aversion Project. In 1970s and 80s South Africa, under the apartheid regime, military doctors ran a secret program called the Aversion Project. The goal? To create behaviors among conscripts in the South African Defense Force. Hundreds of soldiers were subjected to forced hormone treatments, electric shock therapy, and other brutal procedures. But the worst part? Many of the victims were as young as 16 or 17 and were often unaware they were even being experimented on. These procedures weren't just psychological, they were physical, and the trauma lasted for decades. The lead physician, Dr. Aubrey Levin, was later convicted of unrelated offenses in Canada years after the truth about the Aversion Project came out. This wasn't medicine, it was war disguised in lab coats. The Guatemalan STD Experiments. Here's one that remained hidden for over 60 years. Between 1946 and 1948, US public health researchers ran a series of secret medical experiments in Guatemala, infecting over 1,500 people, including prisoners and mental health patients, with sexually transmitted infections, without consent. Their aim was to test if antibiotics could prevent or treat diseases. But the victims weren't told anything. They were simply used, monitored, and forgotten. This experiment didn't even come to light until 2010, when historian Susan Reverby stumbled upon records in a US archive. President Obama later issued a formal apology to the Guatemalan government. But for the victims and their families, justice came far too late, and barely at all. Human radiation experiments. From the 1940s through 1970s, various US agencies, including the Department of Energy, conducted hundreds of radiation experiments on unsuspecting individuals. This included injecting plutonium and uranium into hospital patients, some of whom were terminally ill, others who had no idea they were even part of a study. The experiments tested radiation exposure levels, absorption rates, and long-term effects. One infamous case involved a man named Ed Cade, a construction worker injected with plutonium in 1945 while recovering from a car accident. He wasn't told what happened, and his broken bones were deliberately left untreated for 2 weeks so scientists could study healing under radiation. These experiments were buried in layers of classified files until the Clinton administration declassified them in the 1990s. The horror unmistakable, the accountability questionable. The Fernald School Radiation Studies in Massachusetts. From 1946 to 1953, scientists from MIT and Harvard, backed by the Atomic Energy Commission, fed radioactive oatmeal to mentally disabled children without their knowledge or consent. These children were told they were joining a science club and would receive extra snacks and parties in exchange. What they actually got? Cereal laced with radioactive iron and calcium isotopes, all to study the nutrient absorption under radioactive conditions. About 57 children were involved, and many suffered unknown long-term effects. The institutions responsible only issued public apologies in the late 1990s. These weren't just unethical tests though, they were betrayals disguised as care. So, these weren't just experiments, they were real-life nightmares carried out in the name of science, war, and power. And while MKUltra still gets all the headlines, these dark projects show the rabbit hole goes far down, way deeper. If this video blew your mind, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell for more stories like this one that's coming soon.